Arratsaldeon guztioi.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. Welcome to this third seminar. We're coming to the end of the race. We're on the home straight, as we often say here in San Sebastian. And as we've said before, we're still trying to fight the pandemic. So please wear your masks and please follow the instructions given to you by the room staff. Now, yesterday afternoon, we saw different pedagogical resources related to community projects, the environment and human rights. And today, this morning, we've seen different materials that accompany the work of eco-pedagogy, eco-social education, the situation of the oceans and activism in defense of the territory. All of them are linked to strategies which aim to guarantee environmental rights, which are basic rights that guarantee other rights, such as the right to health, the right to education, or the right not to have to move in a context of disasters and climate change. Now, those of you who are following us over the internet, you can participate through the chat. And if anyone wants to share anything on the social media, I would like to remind you that we have the hashtag Eskura Mintegia, Eskura Seminario, or Eskura Summit. Or you can tag the Eskura Center through the networks at eskura.ayete. Now, this afternoon, we're going to be talking about the overlap between environmental rights and the right to equality. We're going to talk about how we have the responsibility and the challenge of coming to an understanding of the fact that they both go hand in hand. Bear in mind that discrimination isn't random and that the gender perspective and environmentalism are intrinsically entwined. In the Basque Country, we currently have the second Basque co-education plan for the Basque education system, the path to equality and good treatment. Because we want a co-educational, environmentally friendly school that provides an opportunity to all students to internalize these values. We also want to make sure that we have informal spaces that co-educate and respect the environment at the same time. We're talking about pedagogical spaces and dialogic encounters that don't discriminate on the grounds of sex and which will enable us to live in balance and harmony with ecosystems. And to unite feminism and environmentalism and to take all that to the educational level, both formal and informal, we're very pleased to have Yayo Herrero, who's come here to outline some of the postulates for an ecofeminist education. Yayo is a consultant, a researcher and a teacher in the fields of political ecology, ecofeminisms and education for sustainability. She has a degree in Social and Cultural Anthropology, a diploma in social education, and is an agricultural technical engineer. And she has a diploma of advanced studies in educational theory and social pedagogy. At present, she is a member of the Garúa Cooperative Society and she lectures at various Spanish universities. She's the author or co-author of more than 30 books and regularly collaborates with different media outlets. She was the coordinator of the Complutense Center for Environmental Studies and Information of the General Foundation at the Complutense University of Madrid and was the Director General of FUHEM. For decades, she has combined her professional activity with active participation in social movements, particularly the environmental movement. She is also a member of Ecologistas en Acción, an organization of which she was also Confederal Co-coordinator between the years 2005 and 2014. So a warm round of applause, please, for Yayo. I'm just going to take my mask off because I've been told we can. It's always a pleasure to take one's mask off, isn't it? Good afternoon to all of you. Thank you all very much for this invitation. It's a pleasure for me to be here sharing this event with you. Now, in the time that I have been allotted, what I'm going to try to do is to talk about and to give you an idea of what ecofeminism is, for those of you who may not be familiar with the term or the social movement that underlies it, and to understand the connection which exists between ecofeminism and other movements which aim to put human rights at the center. So how they all connect up, and I think they're in fact indissociable. And I want to give you some ideas about how we can move forward, how we can educate younger generations and to give you some ideas and some examples of some educational resources which exist. I'm sure there are probably many more, but I'm just going to talk to you and share with you just a few examples that really struck my attention. Now, ecofeminism is just a social movement, basically, and it's a school of thought. It's two things at the same time, and this is very important. So I can't understand critical thinking, schools of critical thinking, which really turn the basis of our society and hegemonic models on their head, because knowing where the structural problems are, identifying how we can solve them, I can't understand how that can exist without actually trying to do something about it. So it's a school of thought and a social movement. And for me, the two are intrinsically entwined. So what is ecofeminism? Well, it's just the potential dialogue which exists between what has been generating a movement such as the feminist movement, which is centuries old, and it's a movement which aims to has an impact of everything that happens to do away with the subordination of women in all the different areas of life. And the environmentalist movement, which is a younger movement in the West. It is much younger. It's only decades old rather than centuries old. And what that movement does is uncover the different structural tensions which exist between the way in which societies have been organized, especially in Western industrialized societies, and then the logic of life, which is the life which keeps us all alive, which supports us on this planet. So when we talk about ecodependency, we need to think about a basic relationship. It's a relationship which exists between any living being and the fabric of life of which we form part. So, for example, human beings, we don't live by ourselves. We live in a natural environment, in a natural fabric, a natural network without which we cannot survive. We are part of nature. We cannot survive without nature. And because we form part of nature, we are full and we are impregnated with the different logics. For example, the closure of different cycles, the question of limits and boundaries. Our planet has boundaries, has physical boundaries, physical limits. We have non-renewable and limits for the renewable energies. And we also have our sinks, the different carbon sinks and the different sinks. And climate change is basically is due to the fact that our carbon sinks have just become saturated. So if we live in a planet with physical limits and physical boundaries, then it's logical to say that nothing can in fact grow in an unlimited manner. And I mean nothing. When I say nothing, I mean a forest. I'm talking about a city. I'm also talking about an economic metabolism, a particular way of organizing the economy. What happens is that conventional economies, hegemonic economies in which we live at the moment, they are economies that don't recognize these boundaries. They don't recognize these limits. They want to grow in an unlimited manner on this limited surface, limited space. So what we call the ecological crisis is basically a physical clash which occurs between economic metabolisms which want to grow in an unlimited fashion, extracting material, generating waste, and our planet, whose limits have just been overcome. Next year, in 2022, we're going to be celebrating the 50th anniversary of the publication of the Miro report on the physical boundaries of the planet. In 1972, it made a series of forecasts based on studies that have been carried out. And it talked about how it was unfeasible to have a population and its economy growing in an unlimited fashion on a limited planet. It predicted how our atmosphere would react, what would happen with minerals, mineral resources and ores, how biodiversity would be affected unless we put the brakes on. And of course, what we see today is that these predictions have come true. Because we didn't put the brakes on, we didn't slow this dynamic that we have, and in fact we have all of these problems now. But human beings are not just eco-dependent beings, we are interdependent beings as well. And what does that mean exactly? The life of a human being in solitude is unfeasible. We cannot live by ourselves. Somebody has to birth us for a start. But from the moment we're born to the moment we die, people, human beings, we need a huge amount of time, energy, work, care. All of these things are provided by other people. I think it's obvious that a newborn cannot survive for the first few years of its life unless somebody cares for it. We're not just talking about cuddling them, kissing them, giving them a name. And in what any culture does is give a child a name and put clothes on them. But in order to love ourselves, to develop self-esteem, we need to see ourselves reflected in a community of which we feel part, which gives us a name and which values us. But it's not just the case during childhood in which we need recognition, we need to be cared for. We're talking about everything that we do when we get up, when we go to bed, when we wash ourselves, when we go to sleep. We're talking about all of these different material tasks that, if they don't occur, this small life cannot prosper. And this, it happens in childhood, again happens in old age. We very recently, we remember all of us the lockdown and the worst moments of the coronavirus pandemic, when we were enclosed and shut and locked in our houses. And we remember what happened in many old people's homes and nursing homes, not just in Spain, but in other parts of Europe as well. We saw what was happening when care for people in old age broke down, because that is a right of people to be cared for in good conditions and to care for others in good conditions. When all of that became commercialized, it became commodified, it became a series of goods to be bought and sold. There were many nursing homes. The people who worked there, we saw that they could do everything that they could, but they didn't have the resources they needed to care properly for older people, especially these elderly people who were falling ill very, very quickly. And I think that this says a lot about a society. The way in which a society looks after its old people says a lot about the society itself. And at this moment in time, I think that we need to really think long and hard about what is happening with our old people, the elderly people in our society, who are often alone in their houses or in nursing homes with people that simply don't have the resources to look after them properly. The problem is that we live in societies which are aging, in which there are people who can't get up, go to bed, go out into the street, wash themselves, or prepare their own food. They can't do that. And they need, again, a very, very intense time of work and care provided by other people, usually from other generations, in order to make sure that these bodies which are so vulnerable in this large and later stages of life are cared for properly, and so that these people can have a decent, dignified life. So we're not just talking about young children and old people. We need to think about functional diversity as well. Depending on what type of functional diversity you have, there may be people who simply cannot survive unless there are other people who are constantly accompanying them, or any of us in a moment when we're ill, for example. And I'm not talking about even a very serious illness. If you just break a leg, you, for 4 or 5 weeks, realize what it's actually like to need people to do absolutely everything for you. You need help to do very everyday activities that you simply can't do because you've broken your leg. What I'm trying to say with all of this is that there is not one single person in the world who can view themselves and consider themselves to be completely autonomous, completely independent. If there are people who consider themselves to be completely independent and autonomous, then they're wrong, because they simply don't exist. It's not true. It's a fallacy. No one can survive unless they have other people around them. No one can survive unless they receive the adequate care for every single moment of their life cycle. What happens is that throughout all of history, and in almost all places in the world, the people who have mainly cared for vulnerable bodies, and we're talking here about bodies that are most in need and most vulnerable, they have always been women, and they continue to be women. And not, in my opinion, because we are genetically better equipped to care for other people. No, it's mainly been women because we live in societies which are patriarchal societies, which assign in a non-free way this mission to women. And when I say in a non-free way, I mean through the education system, which is why it's so important to talk about co-education and to put the whole issue of care right at the centre of everything that we do right from the very beginning of the people's and children's educational career. And it's also important to work with families, because the socialization process what it does is very subtly and also almost unintentionally means that, in fact, it's generally girls who just take on the obligation and feel the obligation to care for others in the family environment. And some feminists call it the obligatory family service rather than the obligatory military service. And I think the concept that it's how we understand love as a result of the socialization process, which is love linked to sacrifice and linked to doing things for others and putting ourselves last. And all of this is linked to the desires of other people, not our own desires. The concept of love, in my point of view, requires reciprocity. It requires mutual support. Love is fantastic. It's a wonderful thing. But there are certain outlooks on love which link it to sacrifice. I don't know if you remember, there was an advert. I think it must have been about 2 or 3 years. It was of a larger chain of shops and stores, and it was advertising the Mother's Day. And there was a photo of a woman. She was about 40 years of old. She was very well dressed. She was very beautiful. And then underneath the photo in the ad was 90% commitment, 5% dedication, and then 100% love. The idea of love linked to sacrifice and of just denying one's own desires, rather than linked to co-responsibility and reciprocity. And often fear means that it's women who don't stop caring. And the feminist movement over recent years has very strongly brought to light all the different types of violence and gender-based violence, which is really just the visible part of the iceberg. This is the murders of women, but underneath there's so much more to it that has to do with appropriation of time, of tasks, and fear, what happens to women in these spaces where they should feel safe, but they don't feel safe. And I'm talking about how women feel in their own homes. So we have all of these elements coincide to assigning this type of work to women. And not just without pay and in the home, in the private sphere, often in public places where they're paid for caring, nursing homes, cleaning services, day centres, centres designed for people with functional diversity. All of these sectors are completely feminized. And at this point in time, most of the worst paid jobs on the labour market, the least protected jobs, the jobs that often simply do not meet the minimum requirements which are set out in the Statute of Workers, most of these jobs, the vast majority, are carried out by women. We were talking about jobs. I don't know if you remember throughout the pandemic when the Spanish government had to list the essential jobs. Many people, in fact, were quite surprised to see that many of these people who earned a very huge salary weren't at all essential. It didn't really matter if they didn't go to work for a few days. And then other, especially female workers who earned a very, very low wage. And of course, there were men as well, transport, haulage conveyors, etc. All of these people apparently were absolutely essential, and yet they're the worst paid ones. And of course, what about the so-called housewives who are the ones who, in fact, have supported everything that had to do with the pandemic, because most of people who were ill didn't actually go to hospital, and children who couldn't go to school, they had to stay at home. And somebody had to look after all of these people. There are some studies which were carried out by the Faculty of Economics at the University of Valencia, in which they measured the increase of time spent on care tasks during the pandemic, and the data showed that the imbalance was huge. It was evident from a gender perspective. So they measured if it was men or women who were carrying out these tasks, and the increase was incredible in the case of women, mainly. So we are eco-dependent, and we're also subject to the physical boundaries and limits of the earth. We are interdependent beings. One by one, we cannot live by ourselves, and so we therefore need attention, we need care throughout the entire course of our existence. And what I'm trying to say here is that for a human life to be sustained over time, for this life to be feasible, to last, and in fact be a decent, dignified life, we need to actually maintain this twofold relationship. We need to maintain our relationship with nature, because there's no food without nature. There's no technology without nature. Where 65% of us is water, and water isn't manufactured by human beings. We aren't possible ourselves without nature. But we also can't survive unless somebody, and lots of people, dedicate their lives to sustaining life. Life isn't sustained by itself. We need to purposefully sustain life. And this work, because it is work, it is a job. Without this dedication, we cannot guarantee social reproduction. Now, from the feminist perspective, we talk about sustaining life and sustainability of life. Now, this is something that we talk about to refer to the fact that lives need to be sustained, and not just in any way. They need to be sustained with dignity, which is why we've heard so many times over recent years, and we still do. We've heard it so often that, in fact, it seems to have just lost its meaning. We've heard that we need to put life center stage. It's become a hackneyed phrase, and in fact, it's losing its meaning, but it is very important. When we say that we need to put life center stage, we're talking about making sure that politics, economics, culture, and everyday life are organized around one single priority, which is the sustainment of dignified lives for every single person. Now, this seems obvious, right? But we need to say it, because at this moment in time, hegemonic economies and hegemonic politics don't have the sustainment of life as their top priority. They have another set of priorities. For example, economic growth, or the reproduction of capital gains rates, and politics and economics and all of the different groups that exists in the world. They have this idea embedded, deeply embedded, that unless economics grow, the economy grows year by year by year, we won't be able to sustain life. This seems to be this fallacy that has just been embedded in our minds. And when we talk from the other perspective, from the other side of things, we're thinking about politics and an economy that's radically different, which has different indicators, which has other priorities, which are radically different from the ones that are around at the moment. And from my point of view, economics, politics, and culture, the predominant ones at least, are at war with life. And they are at war with life because they're not aware of what's happening. They destroy, they deteriorate the codependent relationships which exist, and also the interdependent relationships which exist. And I don't have time to go into too much detail into all of this, but I would like to just briefly outline some elements so that you get a better idea of what I mean when I'm talking about them being at war with life. At the moment, we're passing through a moment in which, unless something drastic happens, almost everybody recognizes something that has been denied up until very recently, and that is that we are faced with a deep-rooted destabilization of the climate system, which is global warming, and that is basically a change in the rules of the game that organizes everything on this planet. So the rainfall, the precipitation cycle changes. The way in which plants reproduce has changed. The way crops grow is changing. There are more droughts, for example. In Spain, for example, we have an accelerated process of desertification in the south of our peninsula. We can talk about forest fires. We're talking about heat waves and spurts of cold weather. And all of this puts at risk lives and also the economic systems as they function at the moment. This climate change, which it affects everybody in the same way, just like the pandemic. Well, of course, it does affect everybody, but it certainly doesn't affect them all equally. Climate change, just like the pandemic, has very serious class biases. So basically, we're saying that the worst consequences are suffered by those who live in poverty and who systematic poverty. There's also another bias that has to do with origin and ethnic origin. It's not the same for rural communities in the southern hemisphere, which in fact bear very little blame for all of it in the first place. There's a bias with regard to age. Heat waves and cold spurts affect older people much more, and especially older women much more than younger people. And of course, the cold spurts also have an impact on children. It also has to do with capacity. So, for example, those who have functional diversity are much more affected, and the gender bias is brutal. When we're talking about extreme climate events in Indonesia or in Asia, for example, when we look at who dies most in the first moment, in the moment of the impact or the flood, if we look at the proportions, the gender proportions, we're talking about 80 or 90% of all those who die are women.
In the first place, because in many occasions it's people that for cultural circumstances cannot swim, haven't learned how to swim. And secondly, because it's the women who are at home are trying to help those that cannot swim because they're very old or very young. So this affects women and men in a very unequal way. Whenever we talk, for instance, about and this was clear in forced exclusion processes, that this bias is even clearer. This is on the basis of the origin in this case, but this bias has a fundamental role. I mean, women are much more affected, much more strongly affected by the consequences of climate change. And women are active stakeholders in the struggle against climate change everywhere on the planet. So we're talking about individuals whose contribution and knowledge is absolutely necessary, essential, in order to be able to turn this violation of the right to a house on its head. I mean, this gender bias is absolutely brutal. A second issue in this war against life is something that we don't talk so much about, although in the last few days we've heard more about it, but we're still not going deeper into its roots. It has to do with the decline in fossil fuels and minerals. This is essential. Back in 2016, the International Agency of Energy recognized that we had already reached the oil peak, which means that per each oil barrel that we extract anywhere in the world, we don't have any additional reserves that can substitute it. So this planet eats up oil, and for instance, food production depends on oil. We're talking about fertilizer, we're talking about pesticides, that are based on oil. And we're talking about all the transport system. You only need to go to the supermarket and look at the asparagus you're going to buy and see where they come from. And look at many products at the supermarket, and you will see that food travels a long way before it reaches your home. 65% of the population on this planet doesn't live on that food. They are the poorest of the planet, who feed on seasonal products that are grown nearby. And therefore, on the one hand, we have rich countries that are very vulnerable because they don't only have lost their food sovereignty, they don't decide what they eat, what they grow, but also their food safety. Because if the wall that surrounds the rich countries in Europe doesn't let the food come in, then we won't have enough food for 2 months, to survive for 2 months. So this question, this issue of oil is essential from the food viewpoint. Also from the urban point of view, let's think of a city, a large city that is a place where nothing is produced, nothing that can be used to stay alive. Everything needs to be brought from elsewhere: food, water, manufactured products. And at the same time, all the waste generated needs to be taken out of the city. The pictures of Filomena are very telling. This is like the still picture of urban metabolism. That's a moment where we see an area in Spain collapsed. Roads were collapsed in the roads. Trucks were collapsed, were there, couldn't move. And it's like, stopping, freezing the picture. And it makes you think of how much mobility and energy you need to sustain a city. Right now, there are 7.8 billion inhabitants on this planet. More than 50% of them live in cities. And therefore, the decline in fossil fuels is key. And what's happening here? What's going on? Well, the combination of this problem with climate change has led to a commitment by political agendas with a transition towards renewables. Whether we want it or not, these are the energies we are going to be living on due to the lack of resources. What's the problem here? That renewables, they can cover the human needs, of course, but they cannot do so in the same way or with the same consumption levels we had with oil. First of all, because oil has been an energy source that had a greater energy capacity. So it has been able to move our cars, our plants, production plants, and ourselves. So renewables have a lower energy return ratio. And secondly, we're moving from fossil fuels to renewables, and this requires using huge amounts of minerals in order to manufacture solar plants. We need so many minerals. So in solar panels, minerals that are finite, like oil, some of them have already reached their extraction peaks. And these minerals are going to be used as well in order to move from combustion engine cars to electric cars. Of course, electric cars are not manufactured out of the blue. You need minerals for that, and they need to be used also to digitalize the economy. So computers, mobile phones, cables, 5G, all that requires a huge amount of mineral. So what I mean by this is when we look at what the scientific community says that is left, or the reserves we've got, feeling that we're going to be discovering new reserves in the coming years, and taking into consideration that mining technologies are going to be improved, of course. And if you look, on the other hand, at everything that we want to do with that, well, it doesn't match, I'm sorry. Or it would match if it only benefits just a small part of the population. What does this have to do with gender? Very much. Where are we mining most of the minerals that are used to sustain the global economies? If you look at oil, the names of a country are going to be very familiar. Syria, Libya, Iran, Afghanistan, natural gas, Venezuela, Colombia, Nigeria. If we're talking about minerals, we're going to have the same countries. Afghanistan, for instance, has a great amount of lithium and rare earths. And we're talking about many African countries here. We're also talking about a great part of Latin America. That's where there's conflict. Sometimes it's formal wars, and in some other occasions non-formal wars, which are the ones that occur when large mining companies come to a place to extract mineral, and then the local communities resist in order to keep their lifestyles. And they resist by defending their territory, of course. So a good part of the articulation and the resistance of the territories is being led by women. Women that are organized in communities, like, for instance, Berta Cáceres, that was killed, and Francia Márquez, who luckily hasn't been killed, but she suffered many attempts. Lolita Chávez, maybe some of you have met her because she had to become a refugee, and she was in Bilbao. So these are just a few examples of women leading this defense of the earth in Latin America. They're struggling to defend the rivers, their territories, and the places where life is sustained. And these struggles are not for their own communities. They're struggles to defend carbon sinks that we all need for life to be feasible on this planet. So there's also a gender bias here. In many cases, these women are accused, criminalized. They're called bitches. They're called useless. They're told to go back to their kitchens. They're harassed with sexual violence for them and their daughter. And they are leading the resistance. And from my viewpoint, this is one of the biggest struggle for the defense of human rights that is going on right now. We can also talk about the loss of biodiversity. We can also talk about, for instance, pollution. We've got massive pollution going on with persistent products and hormones that affect mainly the bodies of women. In this case, for a physiological reason, because the body of a woman has a higher content of fat than men. Even the thinnest woman has more fat than a man having her own complexion. So this fat tissue that works as bioaccumulators, and this is why hormone pollutants generate a higher number of diseases in women, like endometriosis. We're talking about breast cancer here, mainly cancer that is related to hormones. Of course, men are affected by hormone pollutants, but to a lesser extent. When we speak about air pollution and air quality, it's also mainly women that are suffering the impact of the diseases that are generated. And they also have to look after older people or younger people that get sick due to pollution. So everything that has to do with the environmental crisis has a very relevant gender bias. And when we talk about gender bias, we cannot forget about intersectionality. Of course, if women on top of this are black and migrant and lesbians, we are adding up inequalities here. And we're adding up domination elements here. So this war against life leads to an ecocide. This is a war, the war of patriarchy. It is a racist war that affects mostly people that have historically lived in territories that historically have been treated like large mines or landfills at the service of central powers. And it is also a very unfair war that leads to huge inequalities and violences. From our perspective, from the eco-feminist perspective, the possibility to guarantee human rights is therefore inevitably based on working in societies that are aware of codependence and dependence and interdependence, right? We're not magically going back to the past, a past where oil would be available to do things in a different way. And we're not magically going to a past where we could maybe go back to climate balance that have sustained human life in the past tenths of thousands of years. We are where we are. So what do we need to build here? Well, how to guarantee rights, not just political rights, not just, for instance, the right to participation and recognition, and not just the rights concerning diversity, which are fundamental, but related to them, and very importantly, we also need to guarantee social and economic rights, which are the ones that are normally forgotten. Well, there's an economist called Kate Raworth who wrote a book which I believe is very motivating. It's called The Donut Economics. And she suggests ideas that are very powerful. She says, okay, we can draw a circle, right, where we're going to be placing the possible environmental ceiling. What's that? Well, what we've got, the physical boundaries of the planet, minerals, greenhouse gas emissions that are possible to guarantee that we do not go to pre-industrial levels. We're talking about conservation and preservation of fertile territory, the phosphorus cycle that's been altered, and without it there could be no agriculture. That's the ceiling, the ecological ceiling. And inside that circle she draws another circle that she calls the social foundation of needs. What do we have here? Well, here we've got housing, healthy food, access to energy, access to water, care, knowing that you're going to be cared for whenever you need that care, knowing that you won't be forced to care for someone and look after someone you don't want to look after, because in many cases, many women are looking after their parents who they have very toxic relations with, so they're not be well looked after for. And she doesn't see her rights guarantee. So between the ecological ceiling and the social foundation, we have a donut, right? Where it is possible to have a safe life for all humans. So that safe life requires a safe situation for Gaia, for our planet, for the animals, for the plant and microorganisms that make up the planet, because they are our travel companions on the planet. Without them, our life wouldn't exist. It wouldn't be feasible. So that's the space where we can have safety, right? That's our safe space, and that is the space of human rights. That's where we can guarantee rights for all individuals. And that means placing or establishing limits to the desires of other people. Inevitably, if the economy cannot grow materially, if we are in a moment of decline, then the economy is going to decrease, right? Materially speaking, whether we want it or not, we're going to live with less energy, less material, less fertile land, out of exhaustion. This is something that the scientific community is saying right now. They're saying things like the Green Deal plans in Europe are physically not feasible. So if that degrowth of the material sphere of the planet is going to happen, whether we want it or not, it can only happen in two ways. One of them, and I'm going to be very provocative here, one of them is a way, well, that Boaventura Sousa Santos called territorial fascism, which means those sectors that have economic, political, or military power can still have lifestyles that cannot be maintained with the resources they have in their own territories. But this is only possible because there are other territories that work inversely by exporting raw material, and where the people that should live on those resources are dispossessed. So if the wall that surrounds the rich countries in Europe wouldn't let food coming in, or energy, or minerals, or manufactured products, the wealthy Europe will only last for 2 months, because all the countries that we call rich countries in Europe need huge amounts of materials that come from other territories, where other people live, where there is life, right? If you look at the European borders, and elsewhere this is also the case, what we have is a complete violation of rights. We see people that are taken back home. We see people that come from countries where the raw material has been depleted. This is brutal, and this is a violation of human rights. That is going on right now, before our eyes. And this is not being perpetrated not just by government or political ideas that explicitly say so, and they explicitly say that these people are worth less than us. They are occurring within the European Union, where we have policies that are completely and absolutely criminal. So we have there a brutal gender bias. This is brutal, whoever it is happening to, right? But let's say that there is an important gender bias that we need to take into consideration here. If this degrowth is is like the one I mentioned, what could, or how would it be in a different situation, in a better situation, right? We're going to accept that this is inevitable, that we'll never again have the available energy and minerals we've had so far. Of course, it could happen if a country comes and gets everything for themselves, right? But let's accept that. Let's accept we're never again going to be having that again. So we have to learn how to live under 3 principles that guarantee that we can expect that human rights are respected. The first one would be a principle of sufficiency. It means that we need to learn how to live with less. This is easily said, not so easily done, of course, because we need to discuss about our needs. And when we speak about sufficiency or needs, well, we need to take into consideration the second principle, which is distribution. Maybe I want to live every day with 300 liters of water, say, right? But if where I live there aren't 300 liters of water available for each human, which means my desire is preventing other people from having water. And you only have to look at the price of energy right now, the price of food that is increasing dramatically lately. So what's essential for life to exist is a right. What is essential for life to be feasible, from my viewpoint, we need to distribute it evenly. And if we take the principle of sufficiency and the principle of distribution into consideration, we cannot forget a third principle that is essential, which is obligations, right? Care is not just something that women should do. This is a job, some work that we need to distribute evenly between men and women and between institutions and the civil society. This is a social work. It is a community work. And when we just leave it in the hands of women and is related to the family, to the private sphere of family, and depends on how much money you've got, it means that the people that are looked after do not have their rights guarantees, and probably the carers are living in bad conditions. So if I was saying that a great deal of raw material comes from Africa and Asia, let's not forget that right now a great deal of, or many women that provide caring work in nursing home, etc., come from those very same countries. So we've got this extractive process going on as well in terms of care. And the last principle would be the principle of care. And I'm not talking about changing nappies or feeding someone who needs to be fed. I'm talking about care as the lighthouse and the lever of public policy and life in common. I'm talking about care basically as the criterion that is going to configure and shape public policy. We can think how a law on migration could be from the perspective of care. We can think about a law on housing or defense could be enacted based on care, how food systems would work, how a law on energy could be from that perspective. This is a radically different perspective. If we only look at how energy or economies grow, what we do is that we're interiorizing this logic of sacrifice, which says that anything could be sacrificed as long as the economy grows. And if that is sacred, well, we justify that the person that cannot afford to buy a house, well, they cannot have it. Or those who cannot pay for their energy, well, they're not getting heating in winter, etc., etc. So we're articulating here a complete system that just doesn't guarantee the most basic rights. We live in societies where rights are not respected, where governments are criminals because they cannot guarantee the essential rights of their citizens. Let me end my presentation by saying that we're probably living in a time where we have an excessive dystopia. And this dystopia could become something very conservative. The dystopic narrative, or the narrative about where we are, that's essential. Because if you don't know that you're in a well, you won't try to get out of it, and probably you're going to do nothing. But once we know where we are, we need, I believe, to build utopian looks. And this is not a fallacy. This is not that we're going to be saying, no, we're going to migrate to Mars. No. We need to have a feminist, eco-feminist imagination that enables us to design new desirable horizons that are compatible with the current material situation. And how would the food system work in that case? How would energy work? How would the cities work? How would the rural areas work? How would the relationship work? How would we care for each other? How would we protect each other? What do we call safety? What do we call a good life? What do we call well-being? What is all that? All this can be reconfigured if we know where we are, if we know what the risks are. If this is not the case, we'll see that we're going to maybe commit ourselves to false solutions that make our problems even worse. Let me recommend you very quickly some material that I believe is essential in order to know more about all these concepts. I would recommend you to use all the material developed by Ecologistas en Acción. There's some material called 99 Questions and 99 Initiatives, which is a proposal of teaching curriculum that is based on the asking ourselves questions and looking at areas where we don't normally look at. I believe you know the material developed by FUHEM. I guess you had the chance to know about them this morning, and I believe that they've been able to develop wonderful material that include the eco-feminist look and also include the social look and how wealth should be distributed. There's also the Index for Inclusion manual that includes a whole series of indicators and guidelines for us to know whether we are living out something in our teaching practice. I would also recommend everything written by José Mari Gutiérrez Bastida and the compilation of material that he's carried out. And I would also recommend the material developed by the Observatory of Globalization in Catalonia. This is an organization that works with an eco-feminist perspective, and very intensely, I have to say. And that's all from me. I thank you all for your attention, and of course I'll be very happy to take your questions and listen to your comments. Anything I can clarify, of course I'll be happy to do so. Thank you very much.
Bueno, Yayo, tu capacidad pedagógica de verdad que no tiene.
Well, your pedagogical capacity knows no bounds. It's incredible. You've explained so much, and it's also beautifully explained and also well connected. It's fantastic. It's a privilege to listen to you. Congratulations over the YouTube channel as well for your presentation. They've sent you congratulations. Would anybody like to ask a question? Jose Manu, he would like to ask a question. Thank you very much. Thank you, Yayo. It's a pleasure once again to listen to you. Now, out in the corridor, we were talking earlier, and we were saying that in this situation, we can catch a glimpse of certain possible solutions, certain possible ways out of this situation, certain alternatives, but things look pretty bleak, do they not? And then we had that problem there's a huge number of gender-based violence attacks, and then there's a problem with the oil supply, the gas supply. Things look bleak. Sometimes we need a push forward. So what can we use as a trigger, as a motivation to reinvent ourselves again from an eco-feminist and eco-social perspective? Well, I had an experience at the end of 2019. I was able to go and spend 2 months in Chile. I was there, I think it was the explosion that happened on the 19th of October. I was going to be there for 2 months, and I actually arrived on the 26th of October. Now, the country was, I don't know, it was a bit of a mix between total chaos and everybody was partying hard. And I'm talking about Chile because we're talking here about the country that's been almost a laboratory for neoliberalism, because 3 months before, what we were talking about here was to study the privatization of the pension system, which is what had happened in Chile, as an example to try to perhaps copy it here. So it was the country that was sort of basically it was a laboratory in which all the precepts of neoliberalism had been applied, but they had very high economic growth rates at the same time. It was also a country in which people really just ignored what was happening. They'd had centuries of individualistic education. Everything has been privatized. And people didn't seem to care. This is what the impression was in Chile. And then a very small increase in the price of transport tickets triggered a huge movement which actually uncovered a huge amount of unease and distress. The pensioners were living in awful situations because the people reached retirement age and they were just thrust into poverty. A health system in which people were diagnosed with cancer and they had to sort of, sell raffle tickets amongst their neighbours in order to pay for the treatment. Everything had been privatized and poverty was rampant, and the environment had been devastated. Chile has a lot of sacrifice zones, areas that have been completely massacred. And with companies, some of which are here on the Spanish Stock Exchange, doing all sorts of dreadful things all over the place. Now, the explosion came, and I was there, and for the 2 months that I was there, people were out on the streets every single day. And it was different this time. It wasn't like the 15M protests in Madrid, and you left the Puerta del Sol square and you went off to a sort of a suburban neighborhood and nobody was talking about it. But there, it was massive. It was a mass movement. Any transport, anywhere, they were all talking about it. Everybody was talking about it. They were out protesting for about a year and a half. There were some terrible memories of the times of Pinochet and all the torture that went on there. And what they managed to do was to actually break down the previous constitution. A new assembly has been called. They wanted to actually just put the old MPs in place in the new assembly, but people said no way. And they set up a constitutional assembly. And I'm telling you all of this because the day before yesterday, with 136 votes in favour, 3 against and 6 abstentions, has just approved the fact that the scenario in which the new constitution will be designed is the framework of the climate crisis and the decline of energy sources and human rights. And why am I telling you this? Is because the most mobilized section of the Chilean population, and it wasn't a very large section, on the 19th of October, or even the 1st of December that same year, they were convinced that nothing was going to change. But there was a huge movement of young people. In the protest, the people on the front line were young people of 13 years of age, 14 years of age, 20 years of age. There was a huge feminist movement. All of the networks that were working with mental health just rose up. And what came to the surface was all this distress, and it was channeled in this direction. And it could have been channeled in a completely different direction, but it wasn't. It was channeled in this direction. There could have been another military coup d'etat, for example, which could have just channeled everything in the completely opposite direction. From my point of view, what made the difference was that underlying this, in the subsoil, there was many more people who were organised than what at first we could see. Organised at a community level, at a neighbourhood level, who were doing small things already. And when everything exploded, they formed small community cores and hubs that were able to do something. And I'm saying all this is because I'm telling you that for me, what is key here is the idea of community. In this day and age, in this current time, we can't be alone. You need to be, a member of a feminist movement or a parents association or a trade union and an environmental group, in Fridays for Future, in associations of teachers, in people, a book club, who knows, whatever. People need to be with other people. We need to just take time away from loneliness and individualism to start thinking together collectively about where we are and what we can do, even if it's at a very small scale. Because the large scale is important, but in order for something big, we need to overcome all of this inertia. We need to exercise collective power, and that starts at a small scale. And we need to set up laboratories of experiences. Now, I'm sure you and me have talked about this many times, but sometimes when you see the forecasts of the IPCC, or you hear what people are saying, and you hear NATO and the Davos Forum, these institutions where the most powerful people are, they understand what's going on and they're getting ready for it. And when you read all this, you just get depressed. It's terrible. But it's also true that humanity has never had the experience of a global environmental collapse, but different communities have had that experience. And even individual experiences, if you get told you've just got 1 year left to live, you still live the next day. You survive for that year. And you continue to try to get better, or at least to set your affairs in order. What I'm trying to say is that in very difficult situations, there's still a lot you can do. Mutual support, neighbourhoods in which people care for each other, consumption cooperatives, Now, I know that cooperative by cooperative, you're not going to change the global food system, but if we can generate eco-social competence, if we can understand what's happening, and if we engage in mutual aid, if we manage to do that, then our territories can become more resilient and more resistant. And this is what really it motivates me and encourages me to keep working, is my work with people. I say, okay, I don't know where we're going, but in the meantime, I'm working with these people and I'm having a good time while I'm doing it. That's great. Joy. I think we all need a bit of joy, don't we? Any questions? Well, you were talking about Chile and how it all exploded, no? Because of bus tickets and the price of bus tickets. What's happening here in Spain with the price of electricity? Because just, the price goes up little by little and no one seems to, know when to say enough is enough. Where's our limit? When are we going to say enough is enough? Because we're actually, we're trained to be vulnerable and trained to be defenseless, right? Yes, I think that the turning points, the trip point, if you like, where the tripwire is triggered, you don't know where it's going to be. Never. It's for example, in the 15M protests, it was quite surprising. I mean, I was there in the protest in Madrid that day, and we went to have a drink after the protest, and in the bar, which was in the Puerta del Sol square, some colleagues came and said, look, the police have just surrounded this group of young children and they're going to beat them up, or young children, youths, and they're going to beat them up. We need to go and stop it. And then there we decided, right, well, we're not going to leave. We're going to stay here. We're going to sleep the night. And then they were there. They stayed there for a month in the end. And then it sort of spread out to the neighborhoods. It wasn't an explosion like they had in Chile, but it was a moment that, in my point of view, it's been one of the turning points that we've had here in Spain over recent years. And it was also international as well, because then we had the Arab Spring, and then we had the Occupy Wall Street movement in the US, and many other things in Europe as well, other movements. And you don't really know what the trigger is going to be. You don't know when it's going to happen, when that leap forward is going to happen. With regard to the price of electricity, there's a lot going on in Catalonia, for example. There's a platform against energy precariousness. I can't remember its exact name. That's not what it's called, but I can't remember what it's called. I think it's the Platform for Energy Sovereignty or something. They actually came up with a citizens' proposal, and in fact, they cannot cut your electricity off without meeting a series of requirements. So it's very difficult for the electric companies and utilities to cut your electricity off. There's also a platform of people affected by unlawful evictions, and they're working with the platforms that have to do with energy precariousness. They're all working. When is this going to sort of explode? We don't know. But at the moment, the electricity prices are going up, and it's ridiculous, and it's not going to stop anytime soon. And even though we socialize, or we need to actually deprivatize the electricity company, even if we do that, then we still have the gas prices, which has to do with the decline of gas and the decline of gas supplies. And then we also have minerals and ore, and there are companies stopped all over the world who have had to halt production because microchips are missing. And the construction materials, the price of construction materials have skyrocketed. Wood, aluminium, all sorts of price rises. Now, this is something... we're going to reach its peak? Yes, of course we'll reach a peak, because the prices have to do with decline, but they also have to do with stockpiling, speculation. But yeah, I think we're going to be going up. These prices are going up and down, but the overall trend is going to be upwards. When will everything explode? When will we say enough is enough? I have no idea. But I think what we can say, that the indications of distress are very clear. young people who go out to drink, and they gather what we call here botellones, which they go out, and because they're not allowed in the bars, they go out to like a field or a square and they drink in the square, and then the police come to try to break them up as if there was some kind of violent protest. I mean, this is a clear sign of distress. We have the far right politicians who are blaming women for doing things that aren't very womanly, who blame migrants. Now, these are clear indications of an underlying distress, because basically we're just looking for a scapegoat. This is what we're seeing. Now, there's a major challenge in front of us, ahead of us. It's an organizational challenge, but it's also an educational challenge, and it's a very stiff educational challenge. We need to be able to reach out to people and work on these issues with them. I believe that we will see explosions, if you like, of different movements. If we look at what happened with the Yellow Jackets in France, this is the same sort of movement that we're going to see here. They start protesting against the rise in diesel prices, which is done without a class perspective. So, for example, if you're trying to sort out the environmental problem, but you do it in an eco-fascist fashion, defending the rights of the people who can pay and just leaving those who can't pay out, on the side of the road, abandoned. Well, no, I mean, that's not right. I mean, I'm an ecofeminist and I'm definitely an environmentalist, but I think that the Yellow Jackets had a point, definitely. So I think there's been an important twist in everything that we really need to pay attention to. I think that the future isn't written. We don't know what's going to happen, and it's going to really depend on how we articulate our ideas and the work that we're able to carry out. Any other questions? I'm just going to ask you one last question. You were talking earlier about mining policy at a human level, care work, and how there are other women from other countries leaving their families unattended to come and to look after our own vulnerable relatives. And it's incredibly cruel, but we see it as something natural. We've internalized it. So if we begin to be aware of this, what can we do? Because we can't just change things overnight, but given this situation, of the situation of these women, for example, what can we do? What's up to us? I don't believe in charity. I believe in finding a solution and dealing with them on an equal footing. And I think there's a political side of things, and that has to do with incorporating putting on the agenda the need to actually make care work decent work, and then also to eliminate racism from all of this and the institutional racism which exists as well. Here in the Guipúzcoa Provincial Council, they did an excellent piece of work with regard to public policy. I don't know if it was in the last term of office or the previous one. I can't remember. There was a director of equality. Laura Gomez was her name. She was a feminist. She was an ecofeminist. And what she did was try to actually put on the public agenda, include in the public agenda, this whole issue. So she worked designing public policies about aimed at supporting cooperatives of men or women, didn't matter, but care cooperatives. So cooperatives of carers, guaranteeing the generation of a series of contracts and public contracting, public hiring, making sure that they would only hire those companies which were NGOs, non-profit companies, in order to make sure that care didn't become commodified, and also to guarantee that the contracts that these women had were decent contracts which enabled them to live with dignity. And they articulated a whole series of public policies to create a series of benefits for the person who was being cared for rather than for the carer. Because what happens with the carer, if the benefits are for the carer, it's like, well, okay, if they pay you for it, then you just have to do it because they're going to pay you for it. But if it was by providing the benefit was for the person who was being cared for, which meant that the person who actually stayed to care for the person was there because they wanted to be there. There were also different modifications to the tax regime in order to enable, to free up resources to be able to pay for that, for example. So in the field of public policies, there are lots of things that have been done, but then often they just get swept away when a new political party comes into power. But they can be used as a guideline. And we can also, I don't know if you followed this, but in fact, there's been a very good example in the Basque Country, but there have been very important movements of female workers of nursing homes who have triumphed because they were incredibly resistant. They had a good resistance fund, and they had very long-lasting strikes, and the workers and the company committees established alliances with the people who were being cared for and their families, and this is key. Working to get people to understand, for example, that my mother will never be well cared for in a care home if the person who has to get her out of bed in the morning has just 5 minutes in which to do that. Or if they just change because their contract runs out and a new one comes in. So there's a high turnover. That's not possible. So it's important to establish alliances, because when we're affected by a strike, then we tend to get really angry at those who are just fighting for their rights. And there's also something else. I'm going to say something that might be a bit provocative, but I believe that each person should clean their own toilet, basically. So there are associations of women, female cleaners, who say that domestic work is something that really domestic service should only exist for people who can't do it, but to pay someone. But paying someone to clean your toilet should, if it's so cheap that you can do it just because you don't want to do it, you don't feel like doing it, you don't like doing it, then there's a real problem there. So these women often just do jobs that the families don't want to do because they don't attach any value to it, and that's the problem. Everything that has to do with keeping the house clean, preparing food, this is work that it isn't considered to be work, and no value is attached to it, even though it is considered to be essential. It's a bit of a contradiction. I remember in the last elections, there was a debate in which there was someone from a specific political party, and there was a representative of a domestic workers association, and the political representative said that she couldn't hope ever to earn a better wage if the only thing she knew how to do was to clean other people's bottoms. Well, for me, being able to clean someone who can't clean themselves, I mean, that's a worthy calling. And just caring for someone, anyone who has cared for someone ever knows that it's a very complex job. You have to make sure they eat properly, they get the medication, they take their medication, that they're well looked after. It's not a simple task. I was in a meeting once, and there was an Ecuadorian woman. She was from Ecuador, and she had spent the last 8 years living in Madrid. And she had come to Spain at 31 years of age. She was actually a qualified nurse in her country, but it wasn't recognised here, that qualification. At that time, she was about 40. And she had actually worked as a live-in carer since that time. And she said, the hardest thing about what I do is not just that you're doing things in order to be paid, and they don't pay you very much. The hard thing about this is that from the age of 31 to the age of 40, you actually live the same life. You live the life of a person who's 90 years of age. So you live the life of a 90-year-old person every single day. And she'd spent 8 years living the same way as a 90-year-old does. And that's really difficult. It's physically hard. It's emotionally hard. It's brutal. And these jobs are really poorly paid, or they're not paid at all sometimes. And there's no regulation. So I think that we have a lot of work yet to be done. There's a lot of work yet to be done. Because I think that production and reproduction are two parts of life, and we need to incorporate them into everything that we do on a daily basis. Yes, there can be no doubt about it. And distribute and share care work, because it shouldn't just be women doing them. Well, Yayo, thank you so much. It's been a true pleasure to listen to you. A warm round of applause, please, for her.